A UN rep suggests housing should be a right, a military vehicle runs over protesters in Venezuela, and BC passes a law to stop employers from stealing tips. I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. A UN rep was in Toronto for some unofficial business recently, and the first story I want to talk about has to deal with her visit. During her stay, she gave her take on the Toronto housing crisis. Her response was, Toronto must treat housing as a human right to end a rental crisis that's currently happening. Her name is Leilani Farha. She is a UN rapporteur who states that she was shocked about the state of affordable housing and implored city councillors to urgently tackle the crisis, embracing a human rights approach. She also says the homelessness on the streets, it's unacceptable in a rich country and a city like Toronto. Skyscrapers are going up that are clearly not intended for people who are in housing needs and clearly are meant for investors. The gobbling up of existing stock by big finance, all of it is problematic. This rapporteur used to live in Toronto in the 1990s and finds the direction the city is heading to be unbelievable. This speech of hers is a common case. According to the Huffington Post, she travels the world to promote housing as a human right, the same speech she gave us in Toronto, rather than simply dealing with it as a commodity for investors to buy and sell. Additionally, she gave some policy recommendations which involve all levels of government to provide residents with adequate and affordable places to live with dignity and to not allow forced evictions and displacements if there's nowhere else for the residents to go. Personally, I always find it interesting how disillusioned some people can be about the housing issue. This notion is just ridiculous. She's taking the typical politician approach to things by promising grand notions and wrapping up ideas in linguistic bow ties. Housing should be treated as a right is essentially the crux of her position, and it's not an appropriate fix to the issue. It just sounds nice. Any level of analysis like we're about to do will reveal how insane this proposal is. First of all, let's just acknowledge housing is a major issue. It's complex and multifaceted. Turning it into a right may in fact do the opposite of what she believes and compound things rather than present a valid solution. She's targeted Toronto in this case, so let's go forward with it and dive a little bit deeper into why it's such a terrible idea. She claims people have a right to housing here in Toronto. Well, first of all, already demand is insane and supply can barely keep up. This is with it not even being a right. Now, let's just promise everyone residency within this finite, highly attractive plot of land. If you thought things were bad before, oh boy, you haven't seen anything yet. Just try and imagine the rush of applicants trying to get into Toronto now that you're entitled to it. It's a counterproductive way to racket up demand to insane proportions, and it will likely be impossible for supply to ever match that. One of the key lessons here is quite the opposite of what she seems to think. You don't have the right to live in Toronto. On the flip side of that, you should have the ability to live somewhere though. Canada has vacant land up the wazoo. Dispersing residents, something she opposes, actually alleviates the stress on these highly popular, massive urban centers. A major roadblock to ever accomplishing that is the fact that nobody really wants to move to those areas because they lack development. Toronto is the place to be. The notion of, by treating housing as a right, will solve all these issues is asinine. There's no evidence to back it up. The craziness runs deeper actually when you look at her policy suggestions. Her proposal wants to remove forced evictions and displacements, a key privilege that protects landowners looking to rent out spaces. I'm not sure how any rational person considers that to be a good idea once they think about it a little bit. Basically, you're saying that the landlord should be stuck with a tenant regardless of whether or not they're crappy. They can destroy the place, not make payments to you, but you're supposed to be okay with that and not go forward with any evictions. The onus is placed heavily, and it's an unfair as well as an unrealistic arrangement that will definitely be exploited. This practically sends private property rights down the drain. They won't exist anymore. The idea of you truly owning your land just becomes a myth. Now, add to that renting spaces out becomes incredibly less attractive with these heavy restrictions on it. If you want to reduce the amount of space on the market, this is a great way to achieve that. Cripple the industry so it's the most unattractive thing to invest in, and it brings the promise of massive headaches guaranteed. This lack of investment revenue from the landlords who don't even want to be in the market anymore, then makes developers less inclined to build anything. It's all about the money. If there's no flow, the investors are losing out on even building the structures in the first place, so housing is not going to be a top priority for their money. So now let's summarize. You increase demand to radical proportions by making housing a right. Anyone has the right to live in Toronto, and you deserve to be here. And at the same time, you decrease supply by handicapping landlords to the ground. Wow, that sounds like a great idea, right? This isn't the first time I've seen political figures make these grandstanding promises. There seems to be a trend that they'll pull out buzzwords and bring out the heavenly ideologies hiding under the cover of grace, but the practicality of these proposals is null. They're just simply said stupid. One reason why they do this is because there is a base out there who cling to these promises. They get excited from these surface level proposals and never bother to dig a little bit deeper into it. I'll admit, it sounds good. Wow, housing for anyone. Everyone has the right to live in Toronto. I can also make a promise that everyone will be a millionaire if you would like me to be the supreme ruler of the universe. The thing is, it's not going to happen, but it might actually get votes. The devil is in the details. You need to look closer at these promises and realize that the snap of a finger and a royal decree might not actually lead to the outcomes that you are being misled to believe. We really should hold these high influence individuals accountable, and don't be afraid to press them. Otherwise, you're just going to get more comfortable spewing suggestions like this. If your notions are never challenged, you don't grow, and there's no development. It just ends up being very shallow thinking, which I feel is the case here. The housing crisis continues to mount, and what we need is practical solutions that won't destroy us in the long term. I think better routes to explore are, first of all, capping foreign investment, and maybe next, looking at creating greater incentives for people to relocate to other parts of Canada. Space really isn't the issue here, it's the distribution. Everyone is so attracted to the Toronto lifestyle, while other parts of Canada are left barren. We need to start building infrastructure and moving people out to these areas. That's easier said than done, but we should start looking in that direction, because the key to all our problems probably lies out there. If you think that everyone should have the right to live in Toronto, well, I hate to break it to you, but you might need a wake-up call. The ideas that were proposed will surely make the issue worse. In all honesty, it even has the potential to break the scales in terms of how bad things can get. It can spiral out of control so easily. One thing we have to recognize is that it's so easy for politicians to take the moral high ground. It's a notion that typically comes with support. Making this a right, you take something people want, something that's hard to get in our current climate, that is morally plausible. People want to hear that, but you have to dig deeper. As I've said, the devils are in the details. You look bad for opposing it, but you have to be practical. This is the realm of politics, and we have to start being real about what we're promising, what we're talking about. It just makes no sense otherwise. Maybe her solution becomes plausible in 1,000 years from now, but in today's world, it's just not there. So enough about that. Now we're going to move on to our next story. Military trucks run over protesters in Venezuela. Before we get too deep into that story, let's go over the chaos that's engulfed Venezuela of late so you can understand the framework that led to this series of events. Currently, Venezuela is locked in a battle of two leaders who are trying to claim ownership of the land. Basically, you have two guys here trying to stick two CDs into the same slot. It doesn't work, and one of them has got to go. On one side of the arena, you have Maduro, who has been described as a dictator, and he's been in power since 2013. He's ruled over Venezuela by decree through powers granted to him via the pre-2015 Venezuelan legislature. His reign has been a massive disaster so far. He's led the country into economic failure, and he's also been accused of crushing opposition by sending them to jail and exiling his critics. Now, on the other side, you have Guaido, who is trying to claim the presidency for himself. He took a public oath to serve as the acting president of the country in January 2019, contesting the leadership of Maduro. Guaido was then detained by authorities, banned from leaving the country, and he had all his assets frozen, so Maduro took action to try and silence him. You may be wondering, well, why didn't Maduro just go ahead and kill him? The answer to that is because a lot of powerful world leaders have taken a stance and they've chosen to recognize Guaido. For example, the US issued a warning about Maduro doing such a thing, and there will be consequences if they killed him, so Maduro has been in line because of that issue. A lot of these world powers have chosen, as I've said, to recognize Guaido, so if Maduro did lift a finger against him, it would be the equivalent of killing a foreign president, and as we've seen from history, things like that typically lead to mass wars. If we look at the way the citizens of Venezuela feel, which is obviously very important, a certain picture is painted. Guaido has an approval rating of 61%, while Maduro's is at 14%. That's near rock bottom. This is all according to a Data Nalosi poll. So Maduro doesn't want to lose his position, and he's been clinging to it as hard as possible throughout this whole debacle. Maduro is framing the entire situation as a coup d'etat led by the United States to topple him and control the country's oil reserves. Essentially, he's starting a conspiracy theory to try and gain back support from his constituents. Guaido denies all this, and he says that powerful volunteers who are peaceful are backing his movement. Now we get to today. The streets have turned to chaos after a military vehicle drove into a group of anti-Maduro protesters attempting to run them over. After this, the protesters retaliated and threw a Molotov cocktail at the vehicle, causing it to burst into flames. Currently, the military is still under the influence of Maduro, and tensions are heightening as Guaido is calling for them to raise up and join the revolt. Some soldiers do support Guaido though, but Maduro still controls the entity. There was also another slightly interesting development that involved Cuba. So Cuba allegedly had troops and militia in support of Maduro inside Venezuela, and they were adding to the turmoil. So Trump goes on Twitter and he addresses this with a series of tweets. This is what he says. If Cuban troops and militia do not immediately cease military and other operations for the purpose of causing death and destruction to the Constitution of Venezuela, a full and complete embargo, together with the highest level sanctions, will be placed on the island of Cuba. Hopefully all Cuban soldiers will promptly and peacefully return to their island. First things first, I love how Twitter seems to be the means of preferred communication now between world leaders. I just imagine the Cuban leadership team on their phone sitting on a couch like, shit, do we tweet back saying sorry or something? Like, how do we respond to Trump? We're literally one emoji away from starting a war. Crazy situation that we've gotten ourselves in thanks to the wonders of social media in the 21st century. This move by Trump basically pins Cuba to the wall, and further action on their part will result in massive economic pain to their country. It's very likely Cuba will comply and pull out. The United States and Canada, along with a plethora of other nations, recognize Guaido as the true leader, but Maduro controls the government agencies, which adds extreme complexity to the situation. How do you deal with that? The UN also got involved and is urging both sides of the equation that conflict should be kept to a minimum. Use maximum restraint. Violence should be avoided at all costs, and restoring peace to the nation should be the dominant objective here. Canada's statement on the issue takes a more firm stance. They say that Venezuelans are in the streets demonstrating their desire to return to a democracy. Canada calls on the Maduro government to step aside and allow for a peaceful end to this process in line with the Venezuelan constitution. As you can see, the pressures are mounting against Maduro as his opposition grows stronger internally and abroad. All the signs are pointing to Maduro's defeat. Any logical person would recognize that and probably resign, but I fear this may not be the case. For someone who clearly doesn't want to lose his power, having your back against the wall is an extremely dangerous place to be in. If he's serious about not giving in, his only other option seems to be violence. Maduro still has influence over the government agencies, but it's slipping fast. In an act of desperation, it's fully plausible that he could take drastic measures. That's why it's so important that world powers monitor the situation. Otherwise, if left to his own devices, there's no telling what will transpire. The same can even be said for Guaido as well. If he gets anxious, theoretically, the quickest way to oust Maduro is to just kill him. For Maduro, the easiest way to deal with the opposition is to just kill him. We don't want either of those outcomes to come true. Hopefully, a peaceful path can prevail, but as we've heard from today, people getting run over by military machines and Molotovs getting thrown, I hope that trend does not continue because it spells an ill ending for the country. This is yet another reason why we should all be extremely grateful for being citizens of North America. That little segue brings us to our last story of the day, and the title of that is BC employers are now prohibited by law from keeping workers' tips. Just from that headline, my initial reaction was like, what the hell? How was that not the law before? How was that not standard practice? It's pretty backwards that restaurants can pay terrible wages and pass the cost onto consumers in the form of tips, yet they're stealing tips away now. That makes no sense. Apparently, before this law was passed, companies could just pocket or prohibit their employees from receiving their tips. So what was even the purpose of doing it in the first place? Why would I tip if it's not going directly to the person who served me? I believe these companies should actually pay their staff a fair wage, and tips should supplement that. It shouldn't be the tips are supplementing them to bring them up to minimum wage. It's just a cost saving for the company that's passed off to restaurant diners. But back to the law. Can't deduct or withhold tips anymore under this legal amendment. You really have to be the Grinch to even do this in the first place, essentially robbing your employees. I've always found tipping culture to be interesting though. In parts of the world, like Japan and Europe, it's not even a thing. Tipping does not exist. Some countries even go as far as taking offense to getting tips. Some of them will view it as an offense, like a pity payment or something along those lines. But over in North America, we have a system where it's so ingrained into our culture that it's become a way of life essentially. Servers rely on it because they can't make ends meet if they just simply take the payment from the employers because they're getting away with paying them subprime rates. It's amazing for companies. Like I said, they get away with paying less, it just shifts that onto the customers. And I must admit, I do like the way it is abroad. Companies should hold more responsibility for their employees instead of trying to pass the buck around. I'm sure these institutions would love to pay as minimal as possible. If they could get away with paying their employees $0 and have customers pay everything, they would do that. But that's an extreme, and it probably wouldn't get to that point because the market would correct itself. Customers would not go to the restaurants because of these insane prices. But you can see where the motivation from the companies lies. They're trying to suppress wages as much as possible and give you some of the blame in terms of taking onus for the employee's wage. I really think tipping is most appropriate when you've received some form of exceptional service and the person truly deserves it, sort of like a reward. Currently, you tip regardless of that, or if you don't, you get hit with a massive social stigma and it just feels awkward. Now, I'm not saying stop tipping. The system is built around that, and we can't just pull out our tips or the employees will suffer massively. We have to rearrange the system itself because all this cost cutting, it's got to change. It's just not the right way to do business. In this situation, we probably have a lot we can learn from our friends abroad. So, that brings us to the end of today's show. Thanks for joining me on the Perri platform. I'll see you soon.